So good morning, everybody, once again. For those anyway who could get into the system so far, but I assume that most of you will get familiar with it as we go along. Well, good to see you all again, and I hope that your summer was uneventful, which again, under the circumstances, is the best outcome anybody can wish for nowadays, and that you're all safe and well. As you might know, our fall session that starts today will consist exceptionally of 7 classes instead of the usual 6. As we are granted a bonus class, so to speak, on November 23rd, because the proximity of the election and its consequences were deemed to warrant an extra class. So for those who would like to keep track, to write it down, please note that we will not have class next Monday, which is Columbus Day, but then we'll have 6 classes on consecutive Mondays. October 19th, October 26th, and then November 2nd, November 9, November 16, and finally, November 23rd. I hope that is clear now. So here we are, early October, wondering where this whole year went, but also how a year which was almost exclusively devoted to fight globally the COVID-19 could result in such major developments in the international arena. And this is just a quick update of events that occurred since our summer break, which was, if I remember well, early July. So that's August, September, October, 3 months, which is amazing. Once again, considering this coronavirus environment. First, a couple of Arab states, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, signed agreements to normalize diplomatic ties with Israel, with more Arab states likely to follow suit in the very near future. Also, the United States reimposed sanctions unilaterally, economic sanctions against Iran. Sanctions that, if you remember, were to be progressively lifted if Iran was shown to have complied with the terms of the nuclear deal, which had been signed back in 2014. And we'll come back to that in a little while. Then recently, 10 days ago, fighting flared up between Armenia and Azerbaijan, 2 former ex-Soviet republics, over the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, a predominantly ethnic Armenian area inside Azerbaijan. And Michel, if you please could show the map of Armenia, Azerbaijan for a second. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh, it's a very small territory. It has 150,000 people. Hero, yes, thank you, Michel. You can see Nagorno-Karabakh here between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh declared independence unilaterally after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Azerbaijan and Armenia also became independent. And after a war, actually, that lasted up to 1994 between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now that territory, which is within Azerbaijan, as you can tell, in Azerbaijan territory, is mostly, its people is a predominantly ethnic Armenian area. It declared independence, as I said, but this independence was only recognized by Armenia and no other country. Now, Azerbaijan has been claiming rights to the territory ever since, and to no avail. And from time to time, fighting over the past 20 years, fighting broke out between the two neighbors, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And these two countries did not hesitate to resort to force to make their point. Now, if I mention this regional conflict, it is because it has the potential of drawing in much more powerful neighbors, particularly Russia, that you see in the northern part of Azerbaijan, Russia, which, it should be noted, has a defense agreement with Armenia, and also, more importantly, a military base in Nagorno-Karabakh, and Turkey, which you see on the western border of Armenia. Turkey, which is also a neighbor and a NATO member state and ally of Azerbaijan, with which it shares strong ethnic, cultural, and linguistic ties. Now, obviously, that poses a dilemma to the United States as well, who would like to keep out of and disengage totally from this conflict. But the involvement of Turkey, which I like to remind you once again, it's a member of NATO, makes things very difficult, because apparently from what I could see in the New York Times today also, there was an article about the Armenian foreign minister calling Washington and wondering why Washington would allow Turkish jets, which are American made, to bomb Nagorno-Karabakh, and why the United States has not done anything to stop Turkey from doing so. So we're going to follow the developments there, which are somewhat worrisome, because it seems that now the fighting has spread and does not only involve Azerbaijani troops. By the way, Azerbaijani troops which are backed by Syrian militias allied to the Turks. So this conflict gets to be internationalized more and more, and Armenia. So in the next week or 10 days, we're going to follow this more closely, and we'll revisit this issue next time we get together. Then another development was, as you might have seen, the growing dissatisfaction, popular dissatisfaction with Belarusian President Lukashenko and his allegedly fraudulent re-election back home. Dissatisfaction that may very well destabilize, and thank you, Michel, for the map, destabilize and jeopardize even Lukashenko's regime in Minsk. That too has to be closely monitored, because for the time being, these demonstrations have been peaceful, but we'll see how things are going to unfold in Belarus. Also, the opening of the US-backed Afghan peace talks in Doha, in Qatar, between representatives of the Kabul government and the Taliban. Talks that has started about a week ago, but not much has been accomplished so far. Now, in Western Europe, the British government has recently adopted a law ensuring that trade between the 4 UK home nations, Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, would remain barrier-free after the end of the Brexit transitional period on December 31st. Now, why is that important? This is important because this law reneges on the UK's previous commitment to the European Union to recognize the primacy of the European Union's rules and regulations in Northern Ireland after the end of the transitional period. And by doing so, it makes the open passage of goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which I remind you is still member of the European Union, it would make it impossible. Now, why? Well, let's say that there is free trade between England and the Republic of Northern Ireland. Nothing would prevent England from imposing its rules, I don't know, in terms of labor, or in terms of environment, or in terms of subsidies given by the British government to British companies in Northern Ireland, which are totally different from the ones that rule the European Union. In other words, let's say that a product is made in Northern Ireland, but with no rules, or there are fewer rules than the same products which are made in the European Union. So Northern Ireland could flood the European Union market with products which are less expensive than the ones made by the European Union. So for the Europeans, that is not acceptable. Not only is not acceptable, but it goes against the commitment that the British government made to the European Union before they signed the agreement on Brexit. So this is where we stand now, and the negotiations continue. According to some observers, this is a bluff by Boris Johnson, who is trying to get more favorable terms out of the European Union before the UK leaves the EU at the end of the year. We'll see. They are running out of time. We are early October, and the two parties gave themselves the deadline of end of October before coming to an agreement on all these trade issues. There is another huge trade issue which has always been there and has not been resolved, which is the fishing issue. As you know, a number of European Union member states are concerned that the UK would impose a quota on what they can fish in the English waters, particularly France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark. All these countries' ships come into the English waters, which have lots of fish, and up to now there was no quota on how much they can, since they were all part of the European Union. But this is a big issue that has not been resolved yet. So the two parties give themselves another 3 weeks to come to an agreement, because as you may remember, all the parliaments of these member states, the 27 remaining member states, have to ratify an agreement if an agreement is reached by the end of the year. For the UK, it won't be an issue since, as you remember, Boris Johnson won handily the last elections in the UK. So he has a huge majority in the British Parliament. He has a 80+ majority of members in the Parliament. But for the EU member states, that's another issue, because amongst themselves, they do not agree on all the terms themselves. So they give themselves another 3 weeks or a little more before all these issues can be resolved. Which again, remains very much to be seen. Also, during this time, NATO and the European Union also have run into their own troubles, internal troubles. NATO, with 3 of its member states, Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey, again, at loggerhead over the recent exploration of natural gas conducted by Turkish ships in areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. Michel, if you could please show the second map. So the Turkish Navy, Turkish ships have been conducting exploration of, there is a lot of natural gas. You see Turkey, you see Cyprus here. Now, as you may remember also, Cyprus is divided in two since 1974. The southern part of Cyprus, the larger part of Cyprus, is under Greek administration. Thank you, Michelle, that's perfect. The northern part of Cyprus is called today, has been invaded by Turkey back in 1974 and forms today what is called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which again, like Nagorno-Karabakh, is not recognized internationally as a state. Only Turkey recognizes this entity, or entity you should call it for better term. Anyway, the Turkish fleet, the Turkish Navy, has been conducting drillings in this area, which Cyprus, Greek Cyprus, considers to be part of its, what is called the Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ. What is an exclusive economic zone? It's an area which is around 200 nautical miles large or wide from the shores of any of these countries that you see here: Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, and Cyprus. Now, the Turks are arguing that since they occupy northern Turkey, these 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone does not belong to Cyprus, I mean the Greek Cyprus, it belongs to them since they occupy this area, and it belongs to the Turkish Republic of Northern Ireland. So there have been a number of incidents recently between Turkish Navy, Turkish ships, and the Greek ships, which are backing Cyprus. So far, the incidents have been limited. But again, here you have 3 members of NATO, which are sort of at loggerheads with each other, which might be a very dangerous situation. And once again, one of them involved is Turkey. And recently, the United States has sent a ship to a carrier to this area, into a Greek military naval base, just as a warning, just to show its irritation with the Turkish activities. So this is one area where, once again, we have an issue within NATO, which has also implication on the European Union, because Turkey obviously is not part of the European Union, but Cyprus and Greece are. So Cyprus, following these incidents, has been calling on the member states of the European Union to show solidarity with Cyprus and to impose sanctions or to take action against Turkey. So it remains to be seen how this situation will be resolved. There have been some discussions between the parties, but nothing has been settled so far. Thank you, Michelle. And finally, within the European Union itself, there have been serious issues following the persistent refusal by some EU member states, such as Poland and Hungary, to take in any refugee stranded in other European Union member states, refusal that was confirmed on the last week during a meeting of the prime ministers of the 27 EU member states in Brussels. After more than 12,000 refugees, you might have seen it on the news, were left homeless by a fire that destroyed a refugee camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. So this is just a quick rundown on everything that's been happening since July. And as I said earlier, over the next few weeks, we'll definitely have the opportunity to revisit some of or all of these issues more into detail. However, today, I would like us to open our fall session with a topical subject that hasn't been addressed yet, because foreign policy has not been addressed as usual. Foreign policy will be left at the end of debates, if all the debates take place, which is the future of the United States as the political, military, and economic world leader. Now, the fact that the United States should lead the world is often taken for granted, at least in Washington, and no wonder. The country has played that role for more than 70 years after World War II. And it is only natural to assume that if the American people vote Donald Trump out of office in November and bring in committed internationalist Joe Biden, the US could just go back to the head of the table, so to speak. But today, American global leadership is no longer a given. And restoring a constructive US role in the world will require much more than just proclaiming that the US is back and reverting to a pre-Trump playbook. First, the US must come to terms with fundamental shifts in its global position, as it has done actually since the Revolutionary War. Let's remember indeed that for most of its first 150 years or so, the United States took advantage of its geographic distance from Europe as well as from Asia to stay generally apart from the world. While the country did not strictly isolate itself, it selectively chose when and where to engage. Now, a first shift came after 1945. And during the Cold War, when the United States embraced the role of superpower and leading force of the so-called free world in its ideological confrontation with the other superpower, the Soviet Union. And as a result, for 45 years plus, countries sought the United States military protection and economic assistance, for fear that the Soviet Union would either invade them or try to undermine their political systems on ideological grounds. The second shift occurred in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which left the United States atop the world, so to speak, as a dominant power in military, economic, and diplomatic terms. That position at the top is increasingly challenged today, and this is why. First, the 21st century, at least so far, has not turned out, has not furnished an overarching shared security threat, akin to that represented by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The administration of President George W. Bush tried unsuccessfully to create one with its post-9/11 global war on terror, which worked for a little while. And also, despite China's growing aggressiveness that is likely to make it America's major competitor for decades, the US effort to stir up a China scare has had limited appeal to countries that want to maintain relations with both nations, with China as well as the United States. For example, India has, as you know, significant disagreements with China. And you remember from our previous classes, the clashes between the Chinese and Indian military up in the Himalayas. These clashes, however, have not prevented India from cooperating with Beijing on matters of mutual interest. And despite all the support that the Trump administration has given Israel, China is now Israel's largest Asian trading partner and an increasingly prominent investor in the Israeli economy. Also, Saudi Arabia, which is another US close ally, may be turning to China for a nuclear weapon program. In other words, a new sort of transactional type of ties based on national interest, economic, military, political, have been progressively replacing the strict ideological divide that ruled interstate relations since World War II, and particularly during the Cold War. Surely, American military power remains crucial for extended deterrence through NATO, as well as through the Indo-Pacific partnerships. But close to 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, at a cost of more than $6 trillion, have demonstrated the limited utility of military dominance for achieving strategic objectives in the changing nature of conflicts in the second half of the 20th century, and particularly in the early years of the 21st. For instance, the spread of nuclear weapons and the growth of economic interdependence have made the cost of great power war much too high. And while major military attacks cannot be ruled out altogether, they are not terribly likely either. as China and Russia, for instance, much prefer, as we saw it already several times, the use of non-military means, such as economic coercion, cyber warfare, and political interference to achieve their objectives, which are basically to undermine and to weaken the American established global order, post-Cold War global order. And finally, domestic factors in the United States have not contributed, to say the least, to enhance the country's image as an effectively and efficiently run country. Since the late 1990s, in just more than 2 decades, the United States has seen 2 presidents impeached, an election ultimately decided by the Supreme Court, an internationally controversial war in Iraq in 2003, and the financial crisis that sent shock waves around the world. Today, the US ranks 27th out of 31 member states of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a group that regroups most developed economies in the world, in terms of social justice, reflecting policies that go back much further than Trump. The US share of global GDP, of global GDP, gross domestic product, which was 51% back in 1955 and 25% in 1991, has regressed further to around 15%. What's more, declining economic equality over the years and the persistent racial issues facing society have tarnished the country's image abroad as a champion of democracy, justice, and the rule of law. And the loss of standing was reflected in the recent US response to the coronavirus pandemic. While it is true that no country has presented a perfect record in that area, and we can see today that many areas of the world, whether it's Europe or Asia or elsewhere, are running into a spike in the number of cases. Nowhere else has the infighting between different levels of government been so fierce, creating public confusion and weakening the messages of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, once considered the gold standard for global disease detection and control. In addition, the proximity of the presidential election and the political gamesmanship that accompanies it has contributed also to deepen the divisions and create public distrust. According to a Scott Rasmussen Ballotpedia survey conducted in July, a few months ago, a mere 11% of the Americans polled responded that they actually trust their government more than they trust themselves and their fellow citizens. So the question is, if only 11% of Americans trust their own government, why should others trust the United States? So faced with this new reality, the US will need to take yet a new turn, a new approach, which will require first and foremost a careful reassessment of the state of its alliances and its whole approach to internationalism. Neither automatically maintaining nor suddenly ending its long-time commitments, but recalibrating them based on current national interests. Now, NATO probably would be a good place to start. Rather than continuing to reprimand its allies for underspending as it pursues rapprochement with its adversaries, the US administration, this one or the next one, should view the North Atlantic Alliance as an instrument for coordinating security policies with Canada and Europe, and guide its partners towards their credible defense, in particular by improving their military readiness in order to deter any Russian aggression on NATO's Eastern European flank. For their part, obviously, the US allies in Europe and Asia will definitely have to increase their defense expenditure. When NATO was formed, the United States' main allies were countries devastated by World War II, teetering on the brink of collapse. This is no longer the case. Those countries are thriving democracies with developed economies capable of contributing to a more symmetric defense effort. If many of them are still reluctant today to do so, it's because their citizens became accustomed to relatively low defense spending and they resist budget hikes and more taxes, obviously. And also because those governments themselves are used to now to being protected by the US military umbrella. And despite frequent warnings from Washington, it has not started with Trump. It goes back a long time, except that this administration has been more forceful in expressing them. Despite these warnings, the imbalance persists today, with the US spending about 3% of its GDP on defense, while most allies devote only 1.5 to 2% in best cases to military expenditure. This parity must be addressed all the more rapidly because only a stronger Europe can facilitate a true rebalancing of US foreign policy towards Asia. Asia, which is a region that requires immediate attention from the United States, and where the situation is probably the most complex. Why? Because in Asia, most regional partners of the US are too weak to counter China's growing power and without an American assistance. On the other hand, however, they have their own interests, as I said earlier, in relation with China, and they are resistant to being pressured into with us or with them alignment. For instance, Japan conducts even today bilateral summits with Beijing. and intra-regional agreements between China and the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations play an even larger part in regional security. So the US will have to find a way to navigate in all those currents, reinforcing other countries in the area, other countries' interest in restraining China, rather than pressuring for bipolarization of the region. That will not be difficult to achieve, and that will need a full attention from the United States. Now, another example of taking a different take on an issue would be the Iranian nuclear deal, which is today under increased geopolitical tension as its sunset provisions are closer to expiration. If you remember, the sunset provisions as a provision that lift progressively all the existing restrictions on Iran's military programs, particularly the nuclear program, which will expire, most of them will expire by 2030, which is only 10 years from now. That obviously provided that Iran, in the meantime, complies with all the requirements included in the deal. Now, the first provision, which is to be lifted, is the United Nations Security Council arms embargo, scheduled to expire on October 18th, two weeks from now. Now, you remember that the US withdrew from the Iranian deal a couple of years ago, even though the international inspectors at the time established Iran's compliance with the terms of the deal. But the US argued at the time that even though Iran might have complied with the terms of the deal, with the letter of the deal, so to speak, it did not comply with the spirit of the deal by continuing to support terrorist activities against its neighbors in the Middle East. So, and recently, as I mentioned earlier, the US decided to reapply sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran. Now, these sanctions, as you might have seen also or heard, have been strongly opposed by the other signatories of the deal. The US was not the only one, was the main one, major one, but not the only one. You had the other 4 member states of the Security Council, Russia, China, France, and the UK, plus Germany. So it was called the P5 +1. Now, all the other countries have been strongly opposed to the US move, arguing that since the United States had withdrawn from the deal officially 2 years ago, it was not in a position to reimpose sanctions since it was not part of the deal any longer. Now, the Democratic candidate Joe Biden promised to rejoin the nuclear deal if elected next month. However, such a move would not solve the problem, and this is why. First, the terms of the deal, which was signed back in 2014, will have to be renegotiated and updated and strengthened as we near the expiration of the initial deal, which is 10 years from now. Now, is that realistic or is that at all possible, considering, number one, that Iran today is wary about the credibility of any American commitment? The Iranians are saying, well, we signed the deal with the United States back in 2014, But then 4 years later, the US has decided to just withdraw from the deal, even though we respected the terms of the deal as had been decided. So this is one position. Then Europe, which is still angry at Trump's obstructions, and also Russia and China, signatories also of the deal, always prepared to exploit a situation despite the fundamental interests they share in a non-nuclear Iran. So today, the debate over America's global leadership has devolved into a false choice between two camps. On the one hand, you have, on the one side, you have the so-called antagonists who would prefer to let the system crumble. And on the other side, you have the nostalgic champions who hope to restore the system to its post-Cold War era level. Well, neither of these positions represent a path forward, and the vast majority of Americans, again, seem to reject both arguments. Again, according to an annual survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, 7 Americans out of 10 say that the United States should be more willing to make decisions with its allies when dealing with when it comes to international problems, even if it means that sometimes it would have to go along with a policy that is not America's first choice, versus 25% who would prefer that the US take a dominant leadership role. Admittedly, the readjustments that I mentioned earlier are vast and ambitious, but they are far less burdensome than a US foreign policy that cannot rely on allies. First, whether the US has alliances or not, American security and prosperity will still require an open and independent Asia and Europe. And also, even if Washington pulls back from Asia and from Europe, the US would still face cyber attacks, financial and infrastructural disruptions, and assault on its democratic institutions. So next January, the new administration, regardless of its political hue, will definitely have to consider these new realities and adjust to them. So one way or the other, whether Trump is reelected or Biden is elected, there should be some major readjustment in the United States foreign policy, considering the realities in 2020. So I wanted us just to take a look at these issues as they're going to come up, no doubt, during the next couple of or 3 debates in the next 4 weeks that separates us from November 3rd. All right, so open to questions on any of these issues. A long moment of digestion. Okay, from Lori. Pierre, is there any there in the agreement between the United States, the Arab Emirates, and Bahrain? It seems like a campaign stunt. I don't understand the question, Lori. Is there any there? There
Is there any substance to it?
Sorry?
Is there any substance to the agreement?
Oh, but it's not sub. You wrote, is there any there? There.
There.
Is there any substance?
Yeah.
Well, these are only agreements for the time being to normalize diplomatic ties. We haven't seen the substance yet, but there will definitely, if they come to fruition, there will definitely be substance, because you can imagine the financial and economic ties that can be developed between the startups in Israel, for instance, and the financial situation of the Emirates and Bahrain. So definitely there will be substance to it. It's not a campaign stunt. Obviously, it helps Trump to some extent, but it must be also recognized that that can change drastically the situation in the Middle East. And even though the Palestinian issue is not going anywhere, it will still be there whether these countries sign a peace agreement in the longer run with Israel. This will have serious consequences economically and financially in the area, definitely. From Mark, do you think the pendulum will swing back with American dominance in world affairs, or has the window closed? That's very difficult to tell, Mark. I don't know. For the time being, I would say that it has moved, and that actually the American dominance, which was basically a unipolar world between 1991, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, up to it was short, actually, up to the early 21st century, with the rise of China around 2008, 2010. It hasn't been particularly helpful for the United States. The United States, in other words, did not take advantage of it the way probably it should have in its alliances, and it swung back and forth. One administration tried to, particularly Clinton, tried to bring in the Russians into the decision-making process. But then after that, the Republicans are more or less pushed back against Russia by extending the NATO alliance to Eastern European countries without taking into account the Russian position in the area, antagonizing Russia, which responded in Georgia and a little bit later in Ukraine. That plus the rise of China in Asia has again swung the pendulum again, and actually the US itself did not show much interest under Obama either to engage any further in international relations, and to limit itself to defend the American interests, particularly the war on terror, as I mentioned earlier, which again hasn't been very successful, even though every country is fighting terrorism on its soil, but there was no coalition, so to speak, since the first Iraq war and then after that, after 9/11, where there was a solidarity movement around many Western countries and the occupation of Afghanistan. After that, it died down to some extent. So again, that plus the disengagement of the United States under Obama, and then even further under the current president, made the situation change once again. Now, will this change again? Will the American dominance in world affairs prevail in the future? It's very difficult to tell. It depends on outside developments, remains to be seen. You mentioned Armenia and Azerbaijan from Steve. Is Iran involved, or have they taken sides? It's very difficult to tell. I'd like to say one thing is that Azerbaijan has a Shiite population like Iran, and there is a large Azerbaijani community living in Iran, several million. So to what extent is Iran involved in that war? I don't know, but there are definitely cultural ties between Iran and Azerbaijan, for sure. From Peggy, do you consider the primary global policy that should be addressed by a new administration? What do you consider the primary global policy? Well, I would think that priority should be given to the relations with China, which is definitely Washington's main competitor, both economically and militarily, and which is in a position to inflict most harm on the American interests around the world than any other country, much more than Russia. So I think in terms of global policy, China should be the main concern, and the relations between Washington and China. Now, how to address China? That's a very complicated matter, and probably I'm not qualified to take position on that one way. I'm not an expert on China, and I'm not qualified to go into details. All I can say that probably China will, in the years to come, be the main interlocutor of the United States in world affairs. And obviously, the American policy in the Pacific will be extremely, extremely important. We see what the developments will be in China. The Chinese also are waiting for the outcome of the elections. So we'll see how they will react in Hong Kong, how they will react over Taiwan, what they'll do in terms of human rights in the provinces with the Uyghur minorities, and so on and so forth, all around the world, actually. So we'll see what develops after the presidential election next month. Has Russia indicated any territorial aggression against Belarus? Since only Lithuania and Poland are the buffers for access to the Baltic states. Well, Lithuania is part of the Baltic states, so it's not really a buffer. It is part of the three Baltic states. The only thing that Putin said is that that was about 3 weeks ago, if things continue to deteriorate in Belarus, then Russia might have to intervene without being specific as to what he meant by intervening. Would he intervene with this little green men as mercenaries in Ukraine were called, who are not Russian, who are Russian soldiers but dressed in with different insignia and different uniforms? Does it mean sending in Russian troops at the request of Lukashenko? Would that mean working out some kind of deal with Lukashenko for Lukashenko's removal and his replacement with another political figure in Belarus who would be friendly to Russia? All that is on the table, and nobody knows exactly how the Kremlin would react. Again, as I mentioned, if you remember, we talked about Lukashenko at our final class back in July. Unlike Ukraine, in Belarus, you haven't had demonstrations against Russia. Belarus is still very close to Russia historically, unlike the Ukraine, historically, ethnically, culturally, and there were no demonstrations against Putin and against Russia. Russia is still considered as the closest friend by the Belarusians in general. So I cannot rule out, and Putin is not sold on Lukashenko and would probably sacrifice Lukashenko if his replacement, again, is still a good friend of Russia. I could see that. We'll see how things are developing in Belarus. They got into a sort of routine with weekly demonstrations in Minsk and other cities in Belarus. So it remains to be seen what the EU member states will do also. I just saw that the French President Macron was recently visited Lithuania, actually on a two-day visit. Lithuania met with one of the major political opponents of Lukashenko, Ms. Tikhanovskaya. They met in Lithuania. So it remains to be seen how the European countries will also react to what's going on in Belarus. From Lori again, but wasn't Obama and Kerry's diplomacy responsible for the Iraq agreement? Yes, they were. But I just like to remind you that this deal was not embraced by everybody, including in the Democratic Party, because it still gave Iran the opportunity of eventually, actually it was kicking the can down the road, many people said, who were opposed to the deal, by saying that the so-called sunset terms were expiring too quickly in 2030, and that all Iran had to do is just wait 16 years before it could go back to building his nuclear program. Kerry and Obama argued that during those 16 years, since there will be a deal between the United States and Iran, there was hope that during those 16 years, the regime in Tehran will open up a little bit and get closer and friendlier with the United States, so that they will renounce to their nuclear program by themselves. They will realize that there is no threat from the United States because they will become friendlier, and that eventually Iran will realize that it is not isolated in the Middle East and it can have reestablish normal relations with the United States. That has not happened. And despite the fact that there are a lot of money sent to Iran after the deal, the Iranian leadership never showed any inclination to reestablish good relations with the United States on one hand. On the other hand, they were continuing to support the Hezbollah, the Shiite militia in Lebanon, and fight in Yemen with the Houthis against Saudi Arabia, and also help different terrorist groups financially and technically. So the US argued after the present administration argued that despite the deal, which again the US admitted that Iran complied with, but it was only narrowly with the terms of the deal, but in spirit, Iran was still violating, was not trying to establish better relations with the United States or other countries in the area, as Obama's administration had hoped. From Tom, some troubling numbers for the USA. Let's try that again. Some troubling number for the USA. We rank 27 in social justice, 27 in upward mobility, 36 in infant mortality, 27 in suicide. Oh, sorry, I should read it out loud. I was reading it to myself. Some troubling numbers, writes Tom, for everyone. For the USA, we rank 27th in social justice, 27th in upward mobility, 33rd in infant mortality, 27 in suicide rates, and 97 in healthcare, despite having by far the most expensive in the world. We also rank third in depression, second in obesity, and first in both incarceration rates and deaths by drug overdose. Life expectancy has also dropped in 3 of the last 4 years, and will certainly do so this year as well. Well, I didn't want to go into all this number. Where did you get them, by the way, Tom, the statistics? In social justice, yes, I mentioned that this is the Organization for Economic Development, or where did you get these statistics? I'm interested. Obviously, there is no comment. There is not much I can comment on, except that indeed the situation is far from perfect.
I've gone over. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There were a couple of different, I guess, sites that I was going over these numbers from. One of the main things that worries me is that in many cases, these numbers have been actually getting worse and worse and worse over the course of the last several years. As a matter of fact, over the course of the last 20 years or so. For instance, in the infant mortality, I was looking over discussions given by Carl Sagan back in 1995, and he was discussing how we were at that time ranking 18th in infant mortality, and what a disaster that was for a nation of our wealth and our resources to be ranking 18th, and now we rank 33rd in terms of that. It's amazing that, you know, what we put our money into, like you point out, like wars and putting them into the military, when we have the capacity to put that money into things which would actually be good for our people. All of our numbers seem to be going in the wrong direction. And it just seems like we're becoming more and more of a dysfunctional nation. And there's a certain helplessness and malaise that's beginning to creep in, that we feel that we're like a bus careening out of control down the road, and that there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, in terms of healthcare, indeed, but that has traditionally been a serious issue, as we saw also last summer or last spring, with the most expensive system in the world, which is not particularly, to say the least, is not particularly efficient compared to other countries in the world, which explains also the mortality rate. When you have, I don't know, 40 million or 30 million, I don't know nowadays how many Americans are left with no health insurance at all. But before the Obamacare, I believe that there were about 45 million people with no health insurance at all, out of 320, which is a huge number compared to Western European countries, or Canada, or Australia, or others. So that explains a number of statistics that you give here, like 33rd in infant mortality, and deaths by drug overdose. which, to be fair, has been going up, unfortunately, all over the world. The incarceration issue is also rates are a specific American issue. So yes, there are quite a few social issues that will have to be addressed promptly.
And the life expectancy drop is unheard of. We haven't had a life expectancy drop like that since 1917, 1918. Of course, when we were in a world war and we had the Spanish flu, the influenza. It's amazing. I mean, we haven't had anything comparable to that, and yet our life expectancy has been dropping several years in a row now.
Indeed. That I saw myself, that life expectancy has been dropping. And what is also extremely concerning is the suicide rate, which has been going up exponentially in this country over the past 10 years or so. Indeed. Indeed. Anything else? Not to finish on the somber note. Well, there is not particularly cheerful note either, but not to finish on something like this. In terms of, if you have any other questions, not necessarily on the U.S. foreign policy, but on any of the subject that I touched earlier, Brexit or Azerbaijan or any other issues. If you have any questions, please. Sherry, at a future session, can you talk about the rise of the neo-Nazi movement in Germany? Yeah, well, we can have something on the rise of neo-Nazi movement in general. We always tend to single out Germany for obvious reasons, because Germany is a country that obviously strikes us the most when we talk about neo-Nazis, for obvious historical reasons. That being said, there is a rise in the right-wing movement, not only in Germany, but all over Europe. So this is definitely a concern for the European countries, which are extremely, probably more sensitive to that issue than the United States, because of what they had to suffer during the Second World War. They had to deal with it more directly than the United States. So I'll take note, and Sherry, I'll try and find some material for one of these, one of our sessions. We'll see what, again, what the future holds for us in the next few weeks as we come in, again, closer to November 3rd, in terms of foreign policy, because obviously when the foreign policy issue will finally come up in the debate, and it will at some point, maybe not a whole debate devoted to foreign policy, even though it could use a whole debate. But again, as everywhere, people are, when it comes to elections, people are more interested in domestic issues, and understandably so, economic and issues than foreign policy issues. We'll look at the foreign policy issues in priority. That being said, we'll take a look at the rise of these movements everywhere. All right.
Pierre,
Yes.
not to bring party politics into it, but can you explain to me why the Republican Party is constantly trying to cultivate Iran as an enemy over the course of the last several years? For 8 years, Clinton tried to normalize relations with Iran. Then when Bush comes in, he has his axis of evil speech, where even though it's the Saudis who basically bring down the towers, he blames Iran for that, and it empowers the the hardliners in Iran, and we have bad relations for 8 more years. Obama tries to normalize relationships with Iran and even manages to come together with an agreement that most people didn't think was possible to put together. And then Trump immediately comes into office and tries to throw it under the bus and eliminates the agreement. What is the idea behind cultivating them as enemies? If we ever met them halfway and worked with these people, I think that we would be in a position where we wouldn't have a problem there. It's an opening for China to get involved there now. It just creates a problem that we really don't need to have.
So I wouldn't put the blame altogether on the Republican Party as opposed to the Democratic Party. As I said a few minutes ago, if you look back and if you look at the Obama-Kerry nuclear deal with Iran, it was not embraced fully by the Democratic Party either. Some of the people in the Democratic Party argued again, I mentioned that earlier, that it gave away too much for something that the administration, the Obama administration, was hoping to achieve, but would not have time. That was 2014, and then the Democratic Party was voted out in 2016. So it is also true that they did not have much time to normalize any kind of relations with Iran. That being said, you have to be two partners to tango, and it did not seem that the Iranians, again, I don't know what was going on behind the stage, but it did not seem that the Iranians were particularly interested in establishing or re-establishing normal relations with the United States. What they tried to do was to weaken the US position in Europe and establish good relations with the Europeans in a way of going around the American sanctions imposed on them. So that didn't sit well with the American administration, even with the Kerry-Obama administration. I don't know what you mean by meeting them halfway, because the Iranians did not make any concession. The only concession that I know of was the signing of the deal, and then indeed complying with it for a period of time. But they continued their missile program, because as you remember, the nuclear deal was a narrow deal. It dealt only with the nuclear program of Iran. It didn't deal with any other subject. And the people who were against the deal, again, argued that it should have included a change in attitude by Iran. I said that earlier, and the Obama administration said, well, that will come eventually if we sign this nuclear deal. Is the first step. It's a stepping stone, and maybe the Iranians, maybe the Iranian leadership will be brought into the international community, and we help them to have good relations with us and the rest of the world. And that did not happen, not during the Obama administration, even less during the Trump administration, which in the beginning, Trump has always spoken out against this deal, to be fair to him, because he claimed that he argued that it gave away too much, and that the Iranians themselves should make more efforts to be friendlier and to reintegrate, so to speak, the international community. And there were no signs from the Iranians that they would be willing to do so. The only thing that was they were interested in is signing this deal, complying with this deal for the period of time that they were supposed to comply with it, and then nobody knew. So I don't know how they can be met halfway.
But I think that the idea, as you said, behind the deal was it was an initial deal. I mean, trust takes time. And the idea was this would be the first initial deal and would be the idea of moving from there to develop a further position of trust and to try to balance the fact that there are the moderates in Iran and there are the hardliners. And we wanted to try to we seem to be cultivating the hardliners. We say we want them out of power, but our actions actually strengthen the hardliners, and the moderates end up looking like, hey, you trusted the United States and look what happened. And you know, they have reason to be much angrier at us than we have at them. We overthrew their democracy in '53. We snuffed it out under Mohammad Mossadegh. We supported Saddam Hussein when he used weapons of mass destruction. He used chemical weapons that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians. We don't exactly have clean hands when it comes to our...
You know that, right?
I never said that. What I'm saying is that they, for the period of time after the post-nuclear deal, they did not show, at least with this leadership, with Khamenei and Ahmadinejad in the beginning, they did not show any inclination to be friendlier to the United States. From 2014, it might take time, but you know that in general speaking, countries and nations have very short memories and even shorter patience when it comes to improving or not improving. Generally speaking, they go to war much quicker than they make peace. So I don't know what could have been done. And again, I'm not in the secret of negotiation that the American side might have had with the Iranian side, which I'm sure they did. But somehow the administration, not necessarily this one, even the previous one, came to the conclusion that not much had been achieved by signing this deal, except that the Iranians would have to comply with it till 2030. Now, obviously, it's not 2014 anymore, so it's 6 years less. There is only a 10-year period. So again, as I said earlier, whatever the new administration is, and irrespective whether it's Republican or Democrat, if they want to save this deal, they'll have to renegotiate it. And good luck.
Jared Zarif, when he was being interviewed with Fareed Zakari about a weekend ago.
Say that again. I didn't hear.
the foreign minister of Iran said
Yes.
that the idea of going back into the deal just fresh now is a non-starter. He said
I know.
his
I
country has
know.
been, their economy has been shattered over the last several years.
I know.
And they want billions of dollars in reparations. They said, we'll re-enter the deal, but we have to redo the deal and you have to
Not
pay us
only
back.
that, not only that, but I think that deep inside, the Iranians do not trust that the Americans would keep their word, even if they signed the new deal, because obviously they pulled out 4 years after having signed the first one. Even though the Iranians, that's their position. Their position is that we have respected and complied with the terms of the deal, and you have pulled out anyway. So what's the point in negotiating another deal when we don't know whether you're going to keep your promises or not? That's number one. Number two, as I also said earlier, the US is not the only country to have signed the deal. There are five more countries which, by the way, would like the deal to go on. But even then they might have been pressured to renegotiate with Iran. And finally, Iran's position is that it's a non-starter. We have a deal, we negotiated it. It's too easy to say 6 years later that let's push back the sunset terms another 10 years. No. We said 2030 in the beginning, we keep 2030. So that will be a no-starter for any US administration, including Biden's. So here we are today.
We'd probably be at war with Iran right now if it wasn't for the election. After we assassinated their leader, they responded by bombing our base. But Trump couldn't do anything with that because if he ended up getting into a war, all Iran would have to do would be sink 2 or 3 liners in the Straits of Hormuz, and you'd have $9 a gallon gas. And that wouldn't be conducive to him getting back in the White House.
Well, I'm not going to make suppositions of what could have happened without the election coming up. We have to see what happens after the elections. But again, no matter what, number one, I don't think that this administration shows a lot of appetite for new conflicts, including with Iran. I personally don't see it, nor the Iranians for that matter, because $9 a gallon might be true if they block the Hormuz Strait. But at the same time, their economy will disappear from one day to next, and then you have a new revolution over there, and maybe they overthrow this. I don't want to go there. I don't know. That being said, what I believe is that no matter who comes next who's the new tenant in the Oval Office, this deal, one way or the other, will either have to be renegotiated or just dropped. Because the Europeans are very annoyed with Trump, not because of the sanctions on Iran. The Europeans themselves do not want a nuclear Iran themselves, because after all, they are closer to Iran geographically than the United States. So definitely they do not want, including Russia, they do not necessarily want, or China, geographically speaking, they do not necessarily want a nuclear Iran. But at the same time, they like to trade with Iran and buy their oil, particularly the EU member states, who used to, the main clients, the main customers of Iran. And they know very well that if they do not respect the US sanctions, then they will have to suffer, the side effects, which is the banks which deal with Iran will be banned from the United States financial markets. and the US dollars. And that's the end of so they're not going to deal with Iran. That being said, their government are mad, but they'll have to comply with American sanctions. So it's very complicated. It's very complicated.
Out of a curiosity, what did you think of Bush? This is going back a bit, but Bush's axis of evil speech. We have the bombings of the towers. 15 of the 19 terrorists are Saudis. The guy who cooked this whole scheme up was a Saudi. His lieutenants were Saudis. The money that was used to basically come up with the whole thing was Saudi money that was transferred out of the country. And then when it comes to the speech about who's responsible, it's North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. I mean, did you literally do like a somersault when you heard that? It's like, wait a minute, what about the Saudis? Don't they bear a little bit of responsibility? Or does money talk and bullshit walk?
Well, I would only say that the Saudi government, it's a strategic ally of the United States in the area, okay? So whether which is absolutely, you're absolutely right. The organizer and the people who carried out the 9/11 attacks were Saudis. The US government made a difference between the Saudi government per se and Saudi citizens who apparently acted by themselves without any approval from anybody in the Saudi government. So that's a position of, that's an official position of the American, was anyway, of the American administration. So there was no need to punish Saudi Arabia for something that some of these bad citizens have done.
So we'll punish North Korea, Iran, and Iraq for something their citizens didn't do.
North Korea, that's another story. It's another part of Asia, which has nothing to do with, well, it's a nuclear power also.
And axis of evil sounds so good. We need 3 countries, so we'll take one out of the grab bag.
Do you know that over 1 million people were marching in Tehran after the attacks in 9/11? And they weren't marching in solidarity with the terrorists. They were marching in solidarity with the United States. That's amazing. There was actually...
There is also, like you said earlier, there is also a serious and a strong opposition to the actual leadership in Iran. I mean, there are 80 million Iranians or 100 million Iranians, and there are a lot of people in Iran who do not agree with the mullah policies, including towards the United States, who would like to reestablish normal relations with the United States. Young people, particularly, would like to come here and study the way they did before, or who would like to have more cultural contacts with, and who are chafing at the kind of impositions, culturally and otherwise, that the government puts on people in Iran, and the restrictions. So you have a lot of people over there who are not free to express themselves the way they could or should, but who are against their own government's foreign policy.
They've always loved American culture over there, but with
Absolutely.
our sanctions cutting off food and medical care and such, it's not the best way to cultivate them for the future.
You're right too. You're right. James. Pierre, bonjour, c'est Shelley. To end on a positive note. Thank you, Shelley. Can you please give us your take on something, if anything, positive happening today in the United States? I don't know it's the United States, but I must say that here in Montclair, the weather is beautiful. We have a beautiful Indian summer day. No humidity whatsoever, very pleasant temperature. And that's about all. Well, the day is still young, so I don't know if there are many positive things happening today in the U.S., but this is one of them. It's a beautiful day outside.
You're married to Marion Cotillard, right?
And
Tell us about her. That's something positive.
no, I'm not. Also, a positive thing is to see you all well and healthy and safe today for our get-together. So that's very, very good to see and encouraging. And so on this note, have a very happy Columbus Day next Monday. And then we'll see each other. Now I guess that most of you, I guess that most of you, why have you disappeared? Can you hear me at least?
Yes.
I hope that most of you will have a beautiful, I'm glad we are done with our session. I hope all of you have a great Columbus Day next Monday. And then we meet again on Monday, the 19th. That will be our next session. All right, thank you all. And and I'll see you on the 9th, is it the 19th? Yes, on the 19th of October. And have a great Columbus Day and keep safe, all of you.
You do the same.
And thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Michelle.
Well,
I don't know, I disappear,
You're still there. We see you in all your glory.
the picture has disappeared from the screen. Anyway.
all right. Well, you're still you. And you told everybody there's no class next week because of Indigenous Peoples Day, or whatever we're calling it now, right?
Indigenous People Day?
Yeah, I don't know. Somebody said it's Indigenous Peoples Day.
Oh, that was also.
I don't think we're calling it Columbus Day anymore. So.
Oh, I'm
Whatever
sorry.
it is,
I'm
it's
not.
a holiday and we're off Monday, so there'll be no class.
As much as I might be up to date on foreign policy, but I didn't realize that Columbus Day is not called Columbus Day any longer.
Okay.
Whatever days, have a happy.
Thank you. Thanks, Pierre. Thank you.
See you all on the 19th. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.